Okay, so we're going to finish up the civil rights movement. This is your last set of video notes for the year, so enjoy them. And then this part of the civil rights movement, we're moving past the 50s and early 60s and moving into the later phases of the civil rights movement. So we're going to be looking at the essential question, what were the achievements and failures of the civil rights movement? So after the Montgomery bus boycott, Martin Luther King takes a much larger role in the civil rights movement. We all know this. He becomes kind of the face of the civil rights movement. So Martin Luther King Jr.'s philosophy was one of civil disobedience, which is the peaceful refusal to obey unjust laws. So he wanted to keep things as peaceful and nonviolent as possible. And you keep on hearing him say, and you'll hear it when we watch Selma and do some other things about the nonviolence that he really focused on. So nonviolent protests took a lot of different forms. We had the Greensboro sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina, where African American students sat down at a whites-only lunch counter. They refused to leave until they got service. So that was one of the forms. So the sit-in became common across the Southeast, became a way for African Americans to try to desegregate some of those public facilities. Then you have the Freedom Riders in 1961, and their goal was to protest segregation on the interstate highways. They finally successfully integrated several bus stations before being violently attacked in Alabama. So they had a couple of rough spots along the way. Of course, the roughest of that was Alabama. Alabama becomes kind of one of the hot spots of the civil rights movement. In '63, there were demonstrations to protest discrimination in Birmingham. Thousands of African Americans, including children, marched peacefully through the city. In the process of this peaceful protest, this peaceful march, the police decided to use dogs, fire hoses, cattle prods against the marchers. One marcher ended up dying. And Americans at this point had the ability to watch all of this on TV, and it was just devastating for most Americans, I think, to watch and see people being treated this way. And finally, as a result of all of this, the Birmingham authorities agreed to desegregate their public facilities. After the events in Birmingham, Kennedy sent Congress one of the strongest civil rights bills in the nation's history. This was in an effort, of course, to gain more equal rights federally across the board. So what ends up happening as a way to show approval for this bill is that you have the March on Washington, which brings 250,000 people peacefully into Washington, D.C., just to support civil rights. And this was not just African Americans. There were white people who were involved in this as well. Martin Luther King Jr. gives his I Have a Dream speech, which is probably the most famous speech of the civil rights movement, if not one of the most famous speeches in American history. So other pieces of legislation that we saw pass, of course, I just mentioned the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Unfortunately, President Kennedy was assassinated before he could get this civil rights bill through Congress. So President Lyndon Johnson took it up as one of his major fights. He was determined to pass it along. This bill banned discrimination in public facilities and outlawed discrimination in employment. It also provided for faster school desegregation and further protection of voting rights. A lot of this applied to some of the loopholes that people in the South had found in the 14th Amendment. African Americans in the South still face a lot of problems with their voting. I think one video that we watched said that 1 out of every 100 African Americans in Alabama was registered, and a lot of this was because of the harsh treatment that they faced when they were registering to vote. So what ends up happening is we see a voter drive in some of the areas of the Deep South, specifically in Mississippi. About 100 volunteers end up going down to Mississippi to help register these votes. what ends up, or register these voters. So once they get down to Mississippi, they end up facing a lot of resistance. 3 of the volunteers were found killed, and other violence included beatings, shootings, and church bombings, which were all in response to just giving people the right to vote. So finally, in the aftermath of all that happened in Selma, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This banned literacy tests, which essentially said that you had to be able to read in order to vote, and other barriers. Grandfather clauses had been outlawed in the earlier parts of the civil rights movement, so these were just the next steps in helping people have that right to vote. The Voting Rights Act also permitted federal officials to register voters in states that practice discrimination. So in areas like Mississippi and Alabama, and even in South Carolina to some degree, there were federal officials making sure that people had that right to vote and that it was not being hindered. So there are there's a split in the civil rights movement at this point. You still have Martin Luther King Jr. and his nonviolent protests, but you start to see people who are frustrated by the slowness of that nonviolent protest. And one of those people was Malcolm X. Like I said, he grew very impatient with the slow-moving civil rights movement. Instead of integration, he called for a completely separate black society. He wanted people to African Americans to open their own businesses, to open their own churches, to just essentially provide themselves with the services that they need. Then you have the Black Power movement, which urged African Americans to achieve economic independence by starting and supporting their own businesses. So these two could really merge together to see, or to answer that question of what some leaders of the civil rights movement felt was the biggest issue, which was, this is moving too slow, we have to take things into our own hands. So causes and effects, just to be aware of, and do write this down because this is important to understand. So the causes of the civil rights movement: segregation laws and discriminations. Discrimination led to unequal treatment of African Americans. You're looking at Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal doctrine. The NAACP is formed to fight discrimination, and remember that was in the late 1800s. So this was before the civil rights movement actually took a deep hold in the United States. African Americans expected equal treatment at home after serving in World War II. So they felt, if we can serve in the Army, if we can fight side by side with people of a different skin color, then we should have the ability to be treated fairly. And then the effects, you have Brown versus Board of Education, which outlaws segregation in schools. You have Martin Luther King Jr., who arises as one of the most powerful civil rights leaders in history. Congress passes Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act. African Americans made political and economic gains, and other groups were inspired to seek equal rights as well. And that's what we see going on today. And I think one of the things to keep in mind is that we still do see some struggles between the African American community and the white community and other communities. And it's important that we, as the new generation, try to do what we can to heal some of the issues that are going on. So last set of video notes is done. Have a great one, guys.